across the fence, the plight of pollinators. We'll talk with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies about their study on the decline of bumblebees. And we'll join a UVM class that's designing landscapes for pollinators with an emphasis on native plants. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Everything from bats, bees, birds, and butterflies are pollinators, and they play a vital role in our food supply. But scientists worldwide are documenting a decline in pollinators. In a few minutes, I'll talk with one of the leading scientists at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. But first, we have this report from Rebecca Gollin about a class at UVM that's looking at landscape design specifically for pollinators.
Better and better on using beneficial insects, and that's really fun stuff. They do the work for you. Yeah.
Students are swarming to farms around the region for a new class offered at the University of Vermont that focuses on pollinators.
Honeybees are first and foremost the most important pollinators for agriculture. And as honeybees were starting to suffer a lot of issues with mites and fungus problems, nosema, and unexplained colony collapse disorder, people were starting to say, all right, we need to make sure we've got something else. What else do we have?
Jane Sorensen, a farmer herself, created the class in response to the growing interest from fellow farmers and landowners, as well as undergraduates.
It's a black plastic that's made out of a corn. The class is called Landscape Design for Pollinators, and it's really a mishmash of landscape design, as the title says, but focusing really on the habitat needs for pollinators.
We started getting more into the vegetables and a little out of the livestock.
With a mix of field trips, site visits, and time in the design studio, the class studies those habitat requirements in depth. They're focusing on both residential and small farm-scale projects. A number of farmers and homeowners from around the state are acting as clients, for whom the students will create specific landscaping plans.
It's becoming very important as people realize how vital pollinators are for our own survival. They pollinate all the flowering crops, pretty much everything we depend on for food, and and so I think it's a very useful approach to landscape design, because as you design for pollinators, you're also designing for ecological functions.
And some of these other ones here, this golden variety that's got...
Pollinators are more than just bees and honeybees or bumblebees. That there are, there's a sweat bee, there's a squash bee that just pollinates for squash plants, which I had no idea things could be that specific. Hornets, wasps, yellow jackets, butterflies, ants, like everything can be a pollinator.
So right here would be the swimming area, and then it has a little waterfall at the end. I have a detailed drawing of that as well.
There are a lot of details for the students to think about as they make their designs, along with learning about a wide variety of insects and plants and how they interact with their surroundings. The students also need to have, or develop, the design skills to put their plans down on paper. Not to mention maintaining a relationship with clients while developing a landscaping plan.
A lot of the challenge with this design was, creating a really productive and interesting landscape that fosters foraging grounds for pollinators and habitat, but at the same time doesn't require the owners to put in too much more work, because the reality is they don't really have the time.
It was very, very daunting at first to, the first time after I met with them, having all these lists of things that eventually we would have, be going through and having to, come together with and come up with ideas. So I was definitely a little bit apprehensive about being able to do everything, because I'm also not a design-oriented person traditionally.
I would take the lawn and reseed it over with different types of clovers.
Because it's such a new field, there are limited resources for the students. So Professor Sorensen has started creating her own, compiling a list of Vermont plants for her students to refer to.
It's quite a complicated process. It involves flowering time for plants, the fruit they bear, how high they're going to grow, their soil requirements, sun or shade requirements.
I was aware of the difference between native plants and cultivars. When I was designing a habitat for butterflies, I knew I wanted all the plants to be true natives. This is a very important topic right now, particularly for farmers, because we have seen drastic declines recently in the last few decades in our native pollinator population. So red is not a very attractive color for bees.
Annie White is getting her PhD in plant and soil science at UVM. She's a teaching assistant for the class and also has a research plot at Sorensen's farm, where she's testing the pollinator attracting abilities of native versus non-native plants.
Honeybees are becoming much more expensive to keep because of all the disease problems. They're harder to get. And we have numerous species of native bees, which I think if we pay more attention to and we restore habitat for, that we can help encourage some of these bees back, and it can be a big benefit to farmers and be potentially more economically sustainable in the long term.
There's a wealth of information about the role and impact of some pollinators, particularly the European honeybee that many farmers rely on. There's much less information about the native species. Sorensen is hopeful that White's research will begin to answer some questions for farmers.
Would it make sense to actually take some land out of production and put it into habitat enhancement for pollinators? And would you see an increase in crops by taking land out of production? In Canada, there was a research that said taking 30% of the land out of production and putting it into habitat actually increased production.
For the bumblebee cycle, the queen emerges in the spring, lays her eggs, starts her nest, creates workers, they have a colony, and then towards the end of the season, like now, she starts producing young queens.
On this day, the class is on a field trip, starting in Jeffersonville at the farm between, where John and Nancy Hayden have been actively trying to attract pollinators to their fields for a number of years.
We're partners with the pollinators, so we're trying to uphold our end of the partnership by providing them habitat.
Along with making sure to have a variety of plants, the Haydens use a number of different techniques to support the pollinators.
We have nest boxes that we put up, and we're also making these mounds of our prunings and covering them with a little bit of soil to provide nesting habitat for bumblebees and places for the queens to overwinter. We've really seen our bee population improving over the years.
Maybe this color is more or less attractive than the purple. It's also a little bit more of a double flower.
White's research is ongoing, so it will be some time before she has final data. But she is seeing some trends and is hoping to provide planting recommendations to farmers and homeowners.
I think that the most important thing when we're trying to encourage our native pollinator populations to come back in our landscapes is trying to choose native flowers that are the most native to our area because they share an evolutionary history with these pollinators.
For now, White and Sorensen will continue to gather and share the information they do know. And these budding landscape designers will keep the interests of pollinators in mind.
Plants are the most essential part of designs. It's how we directly relate to the earth around us. They capture and filter water, they provide food, they provide habitat, fuel, so much part of our lives, and I think that this class really emphasizes the importance of that.
And these bushes are berry bushes.
If you're going to plant veggies, plant some flowers next to them, because to have them you have to draw them and you have to provide the food that they need, and it can't just be for that one period while your squash and your pumpkins are blooming. It's a season-long thing.
Improving pollinator populations is a topic that's generating a lot of buzz around Vermont. This new class at UVM is giving students the skills they need to design a future that's not just for the birds, but also for the bees. In Burlington, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
Well, joining me now is Kent McFarland. Kent is a biologist and co-founder of the Vermont Center for Eco Studies in Norwich. He helped lead a study by the center that documents a significant decline of bumblebees in Vermont. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So what was the reason for surveying bumblebees?
Well, worldwide there was a concern about pollinator declines, and one of my colleagues, Leif Richardson from Dartmouth College, had been following bumblebees in Vermont and noticed that in Vermont some of the populations were declining, but we didn't have a lot of data. So we put together the idea of using citizen scientists and go all over Vermont and try to find out where bumblebees were habitating and where they weren't, and then also visit the UVM insect collection and find out all the historic data there and determine if there had been any changes over time.
And so what did you find?
Well, we found that there have been some drastic changes. Luckily, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, even into the 90s, UVM students had done a lot of collecting of bumblebees around the Burlington area and even outward from there. And so we had a great data set there to compare to. They had found over time about 17 species of bumblebees.
Really?
Yeah. Unfortunately, our 2-year study in 2012 and then last summer, we were only able to come up with about 12 species of bumblebees. In fact, we think maybe 3 species might actually be gone from Vermont.
Really?
And this only happened probably in the last decade or so. So it's been a very recent event.
And so how is it the concern about bumblebees different than what we've been hearing about honeybees?
Well, there's a lot of similarities actually with the problem with bumblebees and honeybees. Both of them have been and are being attacked by introduced parasites. Some parasites that reduce their health and in some cases outright kill them. In the case of bumblebees, these parasites we think were introduced as recently as the 1990s, probably from Europe. And the bumblebees just had no resistance to them. And it was sort of like back when we introduced smallpox to the New World and humans really got ill and died in drastic numbers. That really probably is what happened with bumblebees.
And so tell me a little bit about a bumblebee cycle.
Well, bumblebees are really great because just like Vermonters, they can deal with a cold winter. They don't migrate away like some of our birds. So when the killing frosts come, all the bumblebees die except for the new queens at the end of the summer and the fall. And they actually find a place to bury themselves underground and overwinter. All the males, all the worker bees, they all actually perish with the cold. And so they survive by just waiting, just like a bear hibernates, waiting underground until spring. And once spring breaks and we get some of those beautiful wildflowers in the forest, that's when the bumblebees crawl out of the ground and start feeding like mad. And as they're feeding, they're also pollinating. And they immediately build up their energy reserves, start a colony, start producing female workers. And once they have enough female workers to go out and do their foraging, they actually just stay in the nest and produce eggs, and that's their job. So all summer long, they're building the colony up. The workers are out collecting pollen, bringing it back to the young. And suddenly, in late summer and fall, they release males or drones out to the world. And they also release new queens out to the world to start the whole process over again.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Yeah. So what needs to happen to protect bumblebees?
Well, you know, the earlier piece about designing for pollinators is really important. All of us can do something about it. We can all design our yards with pollinators in mind. And there's even things that farmers can do, and a lot of them are already doing that. In Europe, for example, a lot of farmers are leaving edges along fields unplanted with wildflowers to sort of attract more natural pollinators to their crops. The less use of pesticides is a really important thing too. We're finding more and more that some new classes of pesticides that you can actually use in your garden without knowing it, called neonicotinoids, are really, really deathly to bees.
Really?
Yeah.
And so how do you know if you're using one of these?
You can read the label because often some of these pesticides have commercial names that mean nothing about the chemical in them, but it will be on the label, and they're quite dangerous to bees even in small amounts. There was a recent event in Oregon with some of these pesticides where in a parking lot of a grocery store, 50,000 bumblebees died in just a few days from this pesticide.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what's the next step for the center on the bumblebee research?
Well, we've done a great job with a lot of help of volunteers of surveying across the state, and now that we have this data, what we really want to do is understand which species are in real trouble and then come up with ways that we might be able to bring them back. Are there certain habitats we need to protect better? Are there areas we need to lay off on pesticide use or times we need to lay off? So in other words, we need to come up with management plans to help bring back these bumblebees.
And it seems like people would be on board with that. You mentioned volunteers.
We had lots of volunteers. Bumblebees are, you know, they're the fuzzy insect. Everyone loves a bumblebee. And farmers really realize how important they are with their pollination services. So between the public and the cuteness factor and the importance to our economies, I think a lot of people would be on board to bringing back bumblebees.
And so how can people learn more about the study and the center?
They could go to our webpage, vtecostudies.org, or give us a call, 802-649-1431. We'd love to hear from folks. We like to spread the word about pollinators and other wildlife issues in the state.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.